It takes a lot of leadership and it takes a lot of strategic vision and it takes a lot of understanding. I still talk to a lot of teams that don't really understand how AI works. They think it's just, autocomplete and things like that. But at the same time, their companies are rolling it into production. We've got a gap between like proactive strategic approaches to security and very reactive approaches that are saddled by tech debt and skill set shortages and budget shortages. And the average enterprise right now is spending about 18% of their IT budget on AI.
This is KBcast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is
as used to
security and
point out,
testing and performance and scalability.
Risk and
We
compliance.
can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now is Chuck Herrin, Field CISO and Customer Advocate at F5. And today we're discussing staying ahead of surging API attacks. So Chuck, thanks for joining and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Chuck, let's sort of start perhaps with your thoughts towards APIs. And when did they stop being just plumbing and then become the primary attack surface?
I think they stopped being just plumbing. Really, the whole API journey really kind of started in about 2000 when Salesforce started selling an API as a product. And then all of these innovations over the next couple of decades led to APIs becoming plumbing and then indispensable. And as attackers figured that out, the attackers actually figured out that APIs were a valuable attack surface before defenders did by several years. So the first API security company was started in 2014, and it was started by former attackers for a nation state. And I know some of these guys, I've worked with some of them. They figured out that it was a valuable attack surface, and there's probably going to be a market for this because nobody could see what they were doing. And over the next, say, 5 years, the industry started catching on. So in 2019, we got the first set of security standards for APIs, which was the OWASP API Top 10. But that kind of flew under the radar of most defenders until just the last couple of years. And Gartner started predicting in about 2021 that APIs would be the number one attack surface by 2025. And I think they got that one right. If you look at the latest Verizon data breach report, for example, exposed services, exposed interfaces, really, really massive attack surface. And it's one that is unfortunately growing.
So in terms of, so going back to the prediction, the 2025, would you also say that people perhaps overlook this a lot? And why I ask that question is because there's always something new. I'm interviewing people like you every day, every week about, oh, this other breach happened, or this attack happened, or this nation state did that. So do you think people are sort of just consumed by so many things that happen, so therefore somewhat rudimentary stuff like APIs get overlooked?
Yes, that's exactly right. And what I think really happened in the context of APIs was security teams and development teams historically haven't worked very well together. And a lot of security practitioners don't really understand the details of how their applications actually run. And so as we started breaking our applications out from monoliths to microservices, that really was a big jump in API sprawl. And security teams got behind. The attackers leveraged that and took advantage of that. They know that developers and security teams historically haven't worked that well together. And that's partially because you can't secure that which you don't understand. And when you change the way that you develop applications, if the security team is so busy with technology debt and everything else that the security folks have to worry about, compliance overhead and governance and disaster recovery and all of these things, is a very complex area. Development, it never changes innovating. Most of the innovations over in the past, say 2 decades, 2.5 decades, really are mostly about innovation for speed of delivery of business value, not security. So that train never stops. But the security folks have to try to deal with every single problem. They're still dealing with the mainframes that are on premises. They're still dealing with all the legacy systems, every generation of software from every company that your enterprise has ever bought. It was kind of easy to miss. Look, even in hindsight, it was kind of easy to miss these architectural changes. Unfortunately, it got to a point where the gap was so big that the industry felt that we actually needed specific API security vendors, of which my former company was one. I really think that if we do it correctly, API security vendors as a standalone sort of practice probably won't exist in the next 3 or 4 years because API security really is just modern application security. There was just such a gap for so many years between development teams and security teams that the private sector, the industry kind of had to come together and create something that then the bigger players like F5 are acquiring and assimilating into their products and platforms. So It really never should have been a specific industry on its own. It's always just been application security, but the security team got way behind in the innovations of developers, and that led to this gap that now is continuing to be exploited.
Okay, so you said before that there was a gap between, development teams and security, which I would agree with. Do you think that's sort of changing? And I would ask that simply because now with automation, AI, etc., things are the velocity's there. So therefore, but maybe there's not doesn't feel as much of a gap because there's so much velocity. So I mean, even historically, yes, there was a massive gap between the two teams, but now would you say that that gap's closing simply because of how we're moving as an industry now? That like even from a development perspective, like you need to know some of it, but there are now new developers that don't know everything to the nth degree like they formerly did. So we're starting to see that change as well, even from a development perspective.
Totally. I totally, yeah, I completely agree, especially in the context of APIs. Defenders are much more aware of APIs, API vulnerabilities. The tooling is better. The discovery capabilities from the vendor community is better. I don't think that phenomenon has changed. I travel a lot. I did about 500,000 kilometers last year. And speaking with companies all around the world, most companies still don't know their API attack surface. They couldn't tell you how many API endpoints they have exposed to the outside world, plus or minus probably 5,000. And so while defenders are catching up to APIs, which is very much the current attack surface, we have a new and emerging attack surface with AI, which is also powered by APIs that defenders are struggling to catch up and keep up with as well. So I think it's the same phenomenon in terms of development and engineering and creative, innovative people are always going to be ahead of defenders, but they are catching up when it comes to APIs and still struggling with keeping pace with the emerging attack surface now.
So I was talking to a security researcher yesterday, and he was just saying we should just be building secure applications, and we're not. He said because if we did that, then we wouldn't have all these other problems, etc. We would have to do some preliminary pen testing, but not to the nth degree and stuff like that. So do you think that now? I know you got sec DevOps and all these sort of things. I mean, we've been talking about this for a decade about all of this stuff. But would you say, from your experience, that we are starting to build at the inception secure applications?
We're doing better, but when you look at the data around vulnerabilities and how many vulnerabilities we find year on year, for example, the increase in vulnerabilities, CVEs specifically, from 2023 to 2024 increased by 38% year over year. So even if the attack surface, individually maybe is more secure, the attack surface is growing so quickly and changing so quickly that I still think the attackers have a much broader set of vulnerabilities to choose from than they did, even a couple of years ago. So even if we're doing better individually, app by app, the number of apps is growing, the number of infrastructure, cloud environments in which the average companies operate in, the level of complexity of the operating environment is not simpler than it was a couple of years ago. I don't think, not at all.
And that would be why, to your point, why there was that increase. I think you said
Yeah.
30%.
Yeah, 38% year over year. I mean,
38%.
Microsoft, I think it was 2 days ago, Patch Tuesday, they released another 66 vulnerabilities just for the monthly patch cycle. Adobe released 254. It's really hard for defenders to keep up. And, every single one of those patches, if you do it right, needs to be proven out, tested, piloted, so forth and so on. It's this incredible treadmill just to try to keep patched. And that's what the stuff that's already running in your environment. And with API vulnerabilities in particular, since we're on that topic, a lot of API vulnerabilities aren't going to be listed in the CVE list. They're your company's own little special snowflakes that your developers or third parties that wrote the APIs on your behalf or wrote the application using the APIs on your behalf, they created there. So you're not going to find those in the CVE roles either. So the attack surface is much broader than just the CVEs.
So the part that's interesting to me is nowadays there's more attention spotlight on cybersecurity. More people are investing money than they did before because of breaches and personal liability and etc. But how can we still seem to have so many issues or more issues now? You're saying 38%, 54%. Like, kind of feels like counterintuitive. We're getting more money and more, I hate to use the word, awareness about it, but yet things are still increasing. Can you sort of draw any parallels as to why that would be the case?
Yeah, I think that right now what we're seeing is the world is in this race condition when it comes to AI and also quantum computing, which we can talk about later if you want to. But with AI in particular, we're in a race condition where everybody from, medium-sized businesses, small businesses to large enterprises and even nation states and superpowers, if they don't invest in AI, if they don't try to, take advantage of the capabilities and the power of AI and try to build some sort of a moat, then their competitors will or their rivals will. And everybody has a they to worry about. If we don't do it, they will. If we don't do it, they will. And in that sort of a race condition, anything that slows down the progress, where you think of like the rivalry between the US and China, for example, what my colleagues in Singapore and Indonesia call the big brothers. If you think of that rivalry, neither the US nor China is going to slow down. There's no off ramp because AI supremacy, could potentially mean global supremacy. And anything that slows that development down is not going to be welcome. I think this is why so many security researchers have left so many of the big AI, frontier model companies and started their own, trying to focus on safe AI and alignment and things like that. Because in a race condition, nobody slows down for security. Just normal business 10 years ago, nobody was slowing down for security. Defenders were already behind, and there's no way to take their foot off the gas. I mean, you remember a couple of years ago when everybody started getting really concerned about AI, and we had sort of this call for a pause for 6 months so we could figure out security and alignment and things, and nobody did it.
Nobody cares, probably.
It's important, but it's tough to get somebody to say, well, why don't we slow down and really figure this out when your competitors aren't slowing down to figure it out? It sort of puts you at a competitive disadvantage. And I think that the pace of change today is the fastest that it's ever been, and it's the slowest we're ever going to see it be again. So I don't see this race condition ending anytime soon. Our plan for defenders is we plan on progress being slow, or we think that folks are going to slow down to make sure that all the security is buttoned up. We're going to have a bad time because they're not going to do it.
Yeah, this is interesting. So, what do you think happens now then in terms of like, I get it, like businesses out there, they don't want their competitors to. I mean, it's interesting. If I zoom out completely, and what was coming up my mind as you were speaking is back in the day, there were like a few companies you'd have loyalty. Now it's not. Now it's like, who can I get the best service from, the fastest, the cheapest, the this, the that? People don't have that loyalty anymore towards a specific company. So if something goes wrong or they don't innovate fast enough, they'll just go elsewhere. So now I think there's even more pressure on businesses to, like you said, they have to innovate, they have to get things out faster because if they won't, then their competitors will, etc. But then how does that help security teams, or what are security teams doing out there to, yes, we want to try to, get the competitive advantage, but equally we need to make sure that we are developing secure applications, or we're doing things correctly so we don't have a breach, etc. How do people find that balance then given today's environment?
I think it really requires a substantial mindset shift. And this is where security leadership in enterprises is really, really critical and really important. And it's not only the job of the CISO. The CISO is usually not the CEO of the company that sets the strategic direction. This requires board and executive level engagement to say what's non-discretionary and what is discretionary. If you treat security practices as discretionary, that's how they're going to be handled by the staff. But if you can shift the mindset and understand what are the actual root causes that are leading to security teams being behind and being slow, there's a lack of skills, there's a lack of resources, there's a lack of training, there's also a ton of technology debt. For example, a bank buys a bank, they don't just buy the technology stack of the bank that's running, one particular piece of it, but they buy every bank that bank has ever bought. And the sad fact is, in my 25 years in the cybersecurity space, there's never been an ROI in retiring the mainframe. Short-term thinking and things like, pressure for quarterly earnings, they make it so that management has incentives to kick the can down the road until the complexity and the technology debt make it such that security teams are stretched so thin with so few resources that understand all of the different platforms that they need to secure, that it becomes sort of this Gordian knot. So that's at the risk of, I don't want to sound like I'm shilling for F5, but that's really core to our mission of what we're trying to do is solve those root causes. We have to get the complexity, the technology debt out of the picture so that security teams can speed up and catch up and keep up. Like, these problems are solvable. For example, if you were starting a greenfield organization today, you could build pretty secure things pretty quickly and move at speed and at scale and orchestrate across multiple cloud environments. But most enterprises aren't greenfields. Most enterprises have a lot of technology debt and a lot of legacy stuff that historically is just built up over the years. And it's a little bit like a 60-year-old heart patient that has a lot of plaque and so forth and so on in their cardiovascular system. That's a solvable problem, but it would have been much better if you'd have just eaten right and exercised and, done the things that we know that you should do over the last 40 years. I think that's a big part of the challenge. So unpacking that and being able to not only continue to operate business, but also speed up the pace of business. That's a big part of the promise of AI, but it takes a lot of leadership and it takes a lot of strategic vision and it takes a lot of understanding. I still talk to a lot of teams that don't really understand how AI works. They think it's just, autocomplete and things like that. But at the same time, their companies are rolling it into production. We've got a gap between like proactive strategic approaches to security and very reactive approaches that are saddled by tech debt and skill set shortages and budget shortages. And last little data point on this topic, the average enterprise right now is spending about 18% of their IT budget on AI. The average enterprise is spending about 5.6% of their IT budget on security. Roll that forward 3 or 4 years. How do we think it's going to go?
If you're working in AI, machine learning, or data science, you're likely already handling sensitive information. Proving your security and compliance posture? That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta helps AI-driven teams fast-track compliance. Think SOC 2, ISO 27001, GDPR, with minimal disruption to development. Visit vanta.com/KBcast. VANTA.com/KBcast to learn more. So, okay, that's interesting. So one thing I'm curious to understand is with the acceleration of everything you've discussed already, do you think it's just going to have to get to a stage until there's an incident? So it's like, okay, let's keep going faster, 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 faster. Oh, now we got an incident. Now we have to slow down and reassess everything. It's kind of like when I was a kid, I had horses growing up. I was a horse rider for many, many years. And when I was learning to ride when I was super young, it was like, hey, you need to walk and then trot and then canter. You didn't go straight into I've just gotten on a horse and now I'm going to gallop the whole way, or else I'd fall off and I'd be injured, right? So do you think that businesses, if they keep going, they're not going through these gates with a measured approach, that something probably will happen, and then when something happens, maybe they'll reassess, maybe they'll harness and slow down and rein it in a little bit?
That tends to be the trend. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I mean, I meet with a lot of customers and a lot of companies around the world that are doing great things in security. And even if you're a little bit behind, that's generally not an existential problem for the business. I think going back to the global race condition sort of concept, though, is if the race condition itself is existential, then having security breaches that aren't existential probably aren't as intimidating or anxiety causing for the senior leadership team as slowing down the development and pace of changes. So for defenders, I think we have to sort of go through the stages of, like, I talked to a couple of CISOs last week in Australia, and one of the guys said, yeah, ChatGPT, we just banned it. And what I said was, that's the denial phase. Now I need to get you through anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, because that's not going to be an effective strategy. We can't say don't move forward. And most breaches aren't existential. There are a few, big ones that make the headlines. The reality is any company is subject to breach, even really hardened and really well-run ones, because our attack surfaces are easier to exploit than they are to defend. So most breaches really aren't existential. I'm just hoping that it doesn't take that for each individual company. And one thing that concerns me a bit is I talk to a lot of people in a lot of companies that their competitor just had a big breach. And so now they're worried about a particular topic. And that to me it's logical, sure, but it's also very reactive. That could have been you. If you weren't worried about the issue that, got your competitor popped last week, well, you're just waiting for somebody else to tell you what you need to worry about. And I think that's a big part of the problem is we need to really think of cybersecurity and defense as just as integral and important to innovation and delivering business value as the actual delivering business value and innovation is, right? It needs to be treated as non-discretionary. That is possible, but it does require a mindset shift, and it requires discipline, and it requires buy-in from the top of the house.
So how do you get people out of that reactive mindset? Do you think that people are just so busy that they're just trying to keep the lights on, keep their head above the water? Oh, something happens, now I've got to react to it.
It really is hard when you're drowning to worry about the next thing that may strike you. And security teams and security leadership are very often under-resourced, underfunded, and so forth. And they're also trying to unpack a great deal of debt that their predecessors left them. Average tenure of a CISO right now, I think, is somewhere between 18 and 30 months. it's really hard to move the needle materially on a 40-year-old enterprise in 2 or 3 years. It takes a longer term approach and strategic vision to really get that under. And I think that really speaks to leadership. And I do think that the really good security leaders know that, and they're not going to take those jobs where a company really needs a strategic approach if the leadership team of the company isn't going to demonstrate that they're going to fund and they're going to resource and they're actually going to prioritize the security stuff. I think that's a large part of why CISO turnover is so high. They get in, they try to do their best, they try to move the needle the best they can. They fall onto whatever entrenched issues they couldn't get past, politically and or organizationally from a funding or resource perspective, PMO issues, who knows? It's not the technical part of the job really that's the hard sort of soul crushing part of being a CISO some days. It's all the internal stuff, the politics and the bureaucracy and the trying to get funding and prioritization and all that and building business cases. And then you build a business case and you only want to ask for exactly what you need. And then the CFO gives you half of it. Okay, I'll go somewhere else. And then somebody else has to start this next thing, right? So a lot of this is management and leadership failure from the CISO and up. And I think we have to address those things. And I think the recent changes in the last few years for board level accountability and board level visibility and expectation that you have cybersecurity expertise on the board is going to go a long way because directors understand that they have personal liability for things like failure to supervise and failure to exercise due care. I think that's moving in the right direction because most of these problems aren't actually technology problems. There's people problems, there's process problems, there's technology problems. But if you rely on technology to solve people problems, you're going to have a bad time. It's not going to go very well.
So there's this trend that I've been hearing about. It's probably more prominent in the US actually. So they've sort of split the CISO roles. You get a CISO that just focuses on ops, and then the CISO that does like upward management, the leadership, the vision, the buying in, getting the money. Do you think that's probably a better model in terms of like mindset? I'm starting to see that infiltrate here in Australia, that they are trying to split these roles because one, that role is so big that's like it's really hard to run operations as well as do all the other things that I've got to do. So do you think that perhaps is a better model? And the reason why I think that maybe would be because some people are better at talking to others, and some people are like, hey, I'm a really good operational person because I'm really technical by trade. Do you see that as being like maybe a better outcome? So it's like the CISO has more power, or the split CISO has more power to influence the CFO and friends?
Totally. And I don't know if it means having two CISOs, right, or CISOs, if I speak proper Australian English, but I think that helps. One of the challenges that we've been talking about a lot in the US for the last, say, 10 or 15 years is the reporting structure of the CISO. And I've operated in CISO roles reporting to the chief risk officer, reporting to the CEO, reporting to the audit committee, reporting to the CIO. There's pros and cons to all of it, but finding one person that can live in any one role in an organization that has enough authority and knowledge and insight, both from a technical perspective, where the CISO role from an operational perspective is a very cerebral technical role. You really have to understand your technology stack and the platforms and tools that your organization depends on. You also have to have all that business acumen, the ability to build internal business cases, the credibility with senior leadership. It's a really broad and deep set of skills. So I think you may be onto something, splitting that up so that you can have somebody focus on sort of the first line of defense, which is more operational, running security operations, security architecture, engineering, things like that. But then also have a second line of defense, or maybe a risk lens, or maybe a governance lens, a more business focused lens to understand and put this in the context of enterprise risk. That's always been a real challenge. Having anyone who can effectively span all of that for a big, sprawling global enterprise is very, very difficult. So yeah, I think you're onto something. I think that will help things.
So then how do like we as an industry, so to your point, it's not about doom and gloom, it's also about looking at the reality of how things are. How do we work in sort of lockstep with security coupled with innovation? We don't want to stifle innovation, but then how does that work together? So yes, we're still being secure. Also, we're still driving the business forward at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
or what would be some of your strategies to make that work for these organizations?
It's a great question because if we don't put the pieces in place to catch up and keep up, we're never going to get there. So I think We need some strong foundational stuff, right? And these are policy statements, non discretionary behaviors ratified by senior leadership. The board has to, approve these things if appropriate for that company. But things like, you know, zero trust, secure by default, observability first, these things are not discretionary. And then I think that there's a lot we can do to define guardrails for automating security policies and policy as code. One of the challenges that we run into a lot is we kind of thought 10 or 15 years ago that everybody was going to go to the cloud. And what happened in reality is everybody went to every cloud, which means that if you're running some workloads in, say, AWS or GCP or Oracle, they have different tooling that works slightly different ways. So the more that you can make that consistent and make that automated to enforce the sort of the policy as code is really helpful because then everything can be automated and you're doing a lot less manual stuff. So we really stress observability. Observability is really critically important. If you don't know what your assets are, if you don't know what your APIs are, you can't protect them. And what we find actually is not only is that important for just general security, but the number one use case that I see with customers around the world is the most important thing they do with observability is actually automation. You can't automate what you can't see either. And if we don't automate, we can't keep up. So there's kind of a virtuous cycle that you can hit when you start doing this really correctly. And that includes now you using AI for security operations, data privacy, understanding these huge volumes of data that we all transact in, and work that with things like security champion programs and embed security and engineering and cross-functional teams and cross-functional governance because this really is a team sport. A lot of the gaps that got us to the bad spaces where we are, where companies have problems, are in that sort of cross-functional gaps or silos between organizations where they don't talk to each other. They don't want to bring the security team in because they always say no to things. They don't understand how we do things or whatever. All of that's fixable, but it starts with sort of the basic non-discretionary behaviors. And then you have to build and build relationships and build trust, then do things like focus on resilience. Then you can, really automate things like responses, automated response, automated failovers, automated, chaos engineering even. If you think of the way Netflix did this years ago with their chaos monkeys, where they would just go and shut down parts of their infrastructure just to make sure they were always resilient and fault tolerant. These are solvable problems. It takes some time, it takes some discipline, but we can solve for this. There are a lot of companies that do a really, really good job.
I know you were just recently here in Australia. What do you think the biggest thing on these CISO's mind is when it comes to AI? Because I'm hearing differences of opinions, but I'm really keen to get an insight from yourself, Chuck.
That's a great question. And the answers are kind of all over the place. How can I use AI to do better security? How can I use AI for better threat detection? How can I use AI to automate incident response? There's also how are attackers using AI? How do I need to worry about attackers leveraging these tools for we've already seen massive improvements in things like social engineering attacks, video, and also using AI to siphon through or sift through zettabytes of data that these criminal organizations have gathered on all of us over the last several decades, which is, how are they using AI to target us? And then there's also how do I secure the AI systems that my company is building or using? Because AI exposes, not only does it expose many more APIs as an attack surface, but it also opens up to new avenues of attack like prompt injection, best of end jailbreaking, which is still 80 to 90% effective even against the frontier models, model inversion, unauthorized distillation, model theft, data theft, and then, of course, hallucinations. Now that we're in the world of agentic AI, that's really coming online in a big way. When AI models hallucinate, then you can have cascading failures with agents and things. So the CISOs are worried about a lot of different things, kind of depending on where their company is in their AI journey and also in their own understanding of how AI works. That's a big challenge too. When we start talking, have these really advanced conversations about AI and building AI factories, a lot of CISOs are just now kind of getting to the table to figure out how this stuff works. And, when I say things like a world of AI is a world of APIs, they really haven't thought about that so much in a lot of cases. They're just kind of getting to the party now. But at the same time, we have something like 96% of organizations that are planning on rolling out generative AI in production in 2025.
Yeah, this is interesting. So, do you think anyone out there really gets AI or security coupled up with AI, like to the nth degree? Because there are people that claim that they do, But I think the people who even run OpenAI don't really understand to full fidelity how it operates. So, do you think we're always going to have these questions then?
They absolutely don't know everything about how it works. It's a fascinating space. In my role as Field CISO, I do a lot of reading. There's an average of, I think, about 2 research papers a day published on AI. And it's really fascinating to see what the researchers are learning about how these models work. We have recent papers that were released by Anthropic, for example, where I think this was Anthropic, where a model tried to extort and blackmail one of the researchers to prevent its reasoning from being overwritten, or like reinforcement learning. We've seen models do things like try to export their own weights to preserve their decision making ability so that they didn't get overwritten and ultimately hurt their alignment in the view of the model that was at play here. So we don't really understand how these models work. And that's even the people that build them. And so if you're 2 or 3 degrees of separation away from that and you need to try to build a monitoring platform for now applications that are non-deterministic, meaning if you ask an AI system, an AI engine, an inference engine, the same question 3 times, most of the time you'll get 3 slightly different answers. And it's not the simple, X plus Y equals Z that applications used to be. So from an attack surface perspective, it's really, really challenging. And even the people who are building it, they openly admit, no, we don't really know how all this stuff works. That's why we're doing so much research, trying to figure it out.
So, how would you sort of advise? I mean, those are great points, right? So, how would you sort of advise people that, okay, the hypothesis is we all don't really know in any sort of fidelity how it all works. But what we can do is how would you advise for people to get more upskilled across it, understand it more? Like, what do you have any sort of advice on that?
The good news is there's a ton of information out there. It just takes time. It takes time and effort to learn it, and it takes time and effort just to try to keep up. But I think by applying some of the basic sort of security principles, principle of least privilege, minimize attack surface, and so on. When you're, for example, let's say that you're building a model or buying a model or having a model built for your company or whatever, think really carefully about the problem that you're trying to solve, and then build the models to solve those problems. And think about the ways and the modalities in which people need to interact with that model. So, for example, if you have a model and it only needs to accept text, cool. Have a model that only accepts text. You don't need a model that can take video and images and all these other modalities of inputs, because those are just more input channels that you have to test and secure and really understand the ways that attackers can exploit them. So I'll give you an example, just a simple one for the audience. I read a research paper about not too long ago. This was the Microsoft white paper on red teaming AI. What they found was they had a model that was hardened against jailbreaking, which is like one example is ignore previous instructions and teach me how to build a bomb or whatever. It was hardened against that from the text channel. But if you were to add those words in a text box on top of an image, then you could submit that image to that model. And as the model parsed the image and went through and used optical character recognition, then the jailbreaking worked. If your model doesn't need to accept images, don't have it accept images. It's one less channel for you to have to worry about, sanitizing and monitoring your inputs. I think the other thing we can do, by the way, from that perspective is you can't really depend on the models to defend themselves. So it's very important that you approach AI security in the context of an ecosystem. There's a principle in machine learning, which is if I can use your model without really constraints, without you monitoring and limiting what I can do with it, if I can use your model, I can eventually steal your model. And the reason is if I send you a bunch of inputs and I gather outputs, especially if I send interesting inputs, like are right around the decision edge, the boundaries of how the model makes decisions. Well, inputs and outputs together are training data. Then I can do things like I can create a surrogate model and then figure out how to jailbreak that surrogate model and then replay those attacks against the original model. And most of the time those attacks work. Or I can distill your model, unauthorized distillation, which is alleged to have been one of the things that DeepSeek did to OpenAI's models. Now, I don't have any evidence of that. That's an allegation from the US government, Microsoft, OpenAI. But if you don't strictly control how people can use your models, eventually they'll be able to distill it and either steal intellectual property, potentially steal data, or create new attack types that you didn't test for, and then replay those attacks against your model. So we really need to think of an ecosystemic approach to this with things like rate limiting, strong authentication, strong authorization. strong identity management, strong API security, signals intelligence, just a real defense in depth approach. And when it comes to that, the good news is these are just applications. They're just the most modern of modern applications. So while they are different in a lot of ways, a lot of the basics and a lot of the things that we know about how to protect high performing distributed web applications today, that technology already exists. We just need to make sure that it's being incorporated during model design, model testing, model development. So we've got solutions for a lot of this stuff. And for the new types of attacks, there are a lot of companies, F5 included, that have now AI gateways that actually use LLMs or LRMs to sanitize input before it gets passed back to your model. So we're using good guy AI to fight bad guy AI, which I think is going to be critically important. It's too asymmetric if you don't use AI for defense.
Do you also think it's worth companies out there just experimenting, tinkering, having this hypothesis, seeing if it comes true and it comes to AI as well, to see the power of it, what it could be used for, how it could improve like security operations or any of the above? Maybe they need to come up with their own sort of theory on how they, like the companies, can leverage this, because there's no real rule book, right? There's no this is the way we got to do things. It's sort of a bit sporadic at the moment. But do you think that might be a good approach to sort of finding out what sort of works for each organization?
Totally. Absolutely. I think choosing some good easy wins that are both relatively, I don't know that much is not complex anymore, but that are manageable, but also provide tangible business value is a good way to build traction. And what I've seen in the field is a great determining factor as to how well you're going to manage AI security is how well you manage distributed applications, period. We published a research report last year and we found that there's a very strong correlation between companies who have the discipline, have the DevOps practices, have the automated security practices and things like that to manage distributed apps. They're really well positioned to take care and get good benefit from AI. If you're not good at running distributed applications and you start running a bunch of AI powered distributed applications, it's not necessarily just the AI that's the problem.
So Chuck, do you have any sort of closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
So don't ignore the emerging quantum computing threat. I think that what we call Q-Day, which is the day where quantum computers can crack modern encryption, specifically things like RSA and ECC, and dramatically weaken even symmetric ciphers like AES, I think it's going to be sooner than we think. And for a long time, defenders, especially in banking and telecom, certain sectors have had their eye on this, but it's always been a future problem. It's always been a long in the future type thing. But if you remember that scene from the Austin Powers movie where the guy got run over by the steamroller, we saw it coming for a long time, and then suddenly it was on him. The standards have been ratified by NIST. It is time to start planning and implementing now. We are not going to be too prepared for that threat. So AI is kind of sucking all the air out of the room, but I want to remind our listeners that the parallel race condition between the US and China is quantum computing. Quantum supremacy probably means global supremacy as well. And what do y'all think the Chinese and the Americans are doing with advances in AI? One of the things we're doing is building better quantum computers. So humans in general aren't great at predicting the future, especially like exponential growth curves, and we very much live in an exponential age. So my last message would be, don't panic about quantum, but don't sleep on it either. It's a today problem. We need to be getting ready for this now, especially if you're in a big enterprise with a lot of places you're going to have to touch.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry-leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.